Date, 76 PST, post-stasis time. This must be a war crime. Major Sumaya Franklin looked down at the document she had been handed, the proposal lying on her desk, causing a confused grimace to form on her lips. Such proposals weren't anything new in Sumaya's job. Much of her time was spent sitting in this office day after day, looking over and approving some of the many thousands of requests a military might make. New initiatives, upgrades, weapons, everything a modern galactic army needed. This suggestion that had been placed on her desk was different. It was the kind of thing that potential future people might make damning documentaries about, an idea that seemed crazy and somehow heretical. We checked with the lawyers, ma'am. They stated the complete opposite, that since they are all legal Terran citizens, that denying such a request might fall foul of several equality laws. Niall O'Connor spoke up as he stood opposite to the Major, a simple professional tone to his voice as he watched her thumb through the document he'd written, proofread, and then provided her. He'd created many such documents during his career, as the military had many problems, and his job was to create problem solvers, to put the right pieces together and create a tool that dealt with the niggling issues the rest of the military couldn't. If he was being honest, this was one of the weirder ones he'd put together. It wasn't even his idea. The people referenced in the document had been the ones to suggest this new covert operations squad. Niall had just put together the feasibility study and done some of the legwork to get the paperwork. He could feel a little sympathy for Sumaya, as everyone he'd shown the proposal to had fallen squarely into one of two camps. "This is awesome," or "This won't end well." The Major had nothing against uplifts. As soon as they were technologically able, humanity had uplifted their animal companions into sapience, bringing their lifelong friends to the stars and beyond, granting them increased dexterity and intelligence through extensive genetic modification. The vast majority of these now Terran citizens were once dogs or cats, with a lesser smattering of parrots, hamsters, rabbits, or other common pets. Sumaya didn't mind those. They were good people. Even the exotic uplifts were mostly fine, the result of a few crazy people who had decided to uplift their pet raccoon or alligator. She could still understand those to some extent. These uplifts, however, I know it's not the politically correct thing to say, but why were these uplifts even created? Out of every animal on God's green earth, someone chose these species. Most people would get offended by that, although having spoken with the members of the group myself, they'd be inclined to agree. The individuals Niall had spoken to were just as strange as their creation, each one fully aware of the reputation they held, almost taking it with pride, the bad boys of the Terran people, a sign that sometimes the Terran chaos went a little too far. Look at this one, Legion. Never mind why they were uplifted, I want to know how. Doesn't the uplift process require a minimum amount of brain power to work with? The how is complicated. Something about a biological communal mind, taking advantage of their lack of individuality to form a consciousness in large groups, makes them functionally immortal as long as their egg batches are never destroyed. As for the why... Niall paused for a moment, reading from his own notes on the group. Legion's creator was a Dr. Fyodor Dmitriev. After he uplifted the first one, his given reason during the press conference was, and I quote, "Because I'm the smartest person alive, you bitches, I can do what I want." He then went on a 3-hour-long, drunken, profanity-filled rant for the rest of the press event. Ended up creating 5 of the uplifts in total, until one of his creations killed him. Legion wasn't the only one of the proposed group that had an interesting upbringing. All of them did. Nobody who would uplift these animals would be considered normal or even stable. Frankly, it was a miracle any of the uplifts ended up even slightly functional in the end, considering their creation. That tracks with what I'd expect. Sumaya continued skimming through the document, feeling a pit of despair in her stomach as she continued to read. No matter their apprehension of this supposed project, she couldn't argue that it wasn't going to be effective. Each of them were already in the Terran military, each with a long list of accolades and successful missions under their belt. Besides the obvious negative PR, there was no good reason to say no, and no good reason to potentially alienate current highly effective military assets. "Can we at least change the name?" Sumaya finally said, shaking her head. It really sends the wrong message. Niall gave a chuckle at that, shaking his head in response. That was one of their hard lines. They see it as a badge of honor, who they are, what they are. They're strangely protective of how people see them. Sumaya resisted the urge to sigh, instead weighing up the pros and cons of keeping this group of highly effective soldiers happy, and the reputation hit should it become known that she signed off on something like this. Visions of various headlines ran through her mind. Major Franklin signs off war crime committing death squad, and Major Franklin, racist refuses to let uplifts fight for our nation. It only took a few moments for the pros to outweigh the cons. Realistically, nobody in the long term would care as long as the group maintained their professionalism, and this wasn't even the craziest thing approved in the Terran military this week. Fine, I give my approval for the Bastard Squad. Raxel didn't like guarding things. Raxel didn't like a great number of things, mostly anything that didn't involve fighting or eating. She was a Hagorthian, a giant species of reddish-brown lizard that had evolved the aggressive trait of never stopping their growth, fueling a biological desire to continually fight and eat in order to sustain this never-ending requirement for resources. Hagorthian culture was filled with a constant obligation to prove your own strength through fighting, the species having traveled the stars, conquering planets, demanding those they enslaved to provide worthy challenges and food sources. Many external researchers had speculated on how the Hagorthians had even managed to build a civilization able to create FTL travel, a few noting the species seemed to take great leaps forward whenever they were led by the very, very few born with exceptional intelligence. None of those had appeared for quite some time, however, as recently in the last 100 years they had allied themselves with 4 other slaving species, calling themselves the Astorian Empire. This empire had unsurprisingly found themselves in a wide-spanning war against the slaver-hating Terrans and their allies. Raxel gave an absent-minded growl as she stood in place, weapon in hand, trying to at least pretend that she was keeping a lookout for any potential threats. The machine behind her glowed and did something. She wasn't sure what exactly. The annoying bird who had handed it over to them said something about blocking waves, quantum entanglement, and a bunch of other words far too long for her liking. Raxel also didn't like long words. Nothing in her life was complicated enough for any word larger than 8 letters. And that was only if you included the apostrophe in the word fightin'. The Lelzoi were also one of the members of the Astorian Empire, the brightly colored xenophobic avians, the complete opposite to the Hagorthians, focusing on the power of intelligence and extracting knowledge from the universe at any cost. As much as Raxel would have been more than happy to grab the annoying talking weak bird and bite it in half, supposedly they had a solution for the even more annoying Terran problem. Raxel both loved and hated the Terrans. On the one hand, the strange primates were always a good fight. Sure, they were small, but then what species wasn't when compared with the Hagorthians? No matter their size, they always had a fight in them, the willingness to go head-to-head in combat when required. Killing a Terran was never an easy thing. It was an honorable and proud thing. Raxel was covered in an assortment of trophies from her nearly 140 years of fighting, teeth and bones strung together into bracelets, fangs, and claws, showing every major kill she'd ever successfully accomplished. There were the fangs of her first mentor, the jawbone of the first Jural she ever hunted, and of course, nestled on the side of her hip was the primate skull of a Terran she'd bested in combat. From before the war, back when less savory and adrenaline-seeking Terrans would visit Hagorthian space to engage in the many acts of ritualized combat that existed. Which was the real problem. While they fought well, Terrans didn't do war correctly. They hid behind automated drones to do their warfare, focusing on losing as few people as possible instead of the glory of combat. Annoying scraps of metal brought no glory when destroyed, no thrill of battle, and being killed by one was just embarrassing and shameful. Supposedly, the machine the birds had brought with them stopped the stupid metal not-soldiers, forcing the primates to fight this war properly. The sound of scuffling could be heard as 2 of the soldiers under Raxel's command started fighting, the boredom of having to guard something causing 2 of the males to start bickering over something unimportant. She could see them both slashing at each other with their claws, attempting to bite each other's neck as the pair tussled amongst each other. There was nothing wrong with this per se. If anyone had a problem with another Haggarthian, it was perfectly reasonable to decide who was right through might. But they had a job to do. Guarding this item was important for some reason, so this wasn't a time to start fighting amongst themselves. Raxel rushed over to the quarreling pair, giving out her own roar of rage as she grabbed the two young reptilians and slammed their heads together. "Oi! Both of you, stop it!" she shouted at them, teeth bared as she looked down upon the two of them. "We have work to do! Leave fight until later!" The younger of the pair turned to confront this new interruption into his struggle for placement and dominance. Before he realized who Raxel was, the hiss in his throat dying down as he kept his eyes pointed to the ground, mumbling an apology. She was the oldest one here, making her the largest at a giant 13 feet tall of muscle and potential pain. Challenging her officially would be a lethal endeavor. Not that any of this would actually matter, because 5 seconds later, the young Hagorthian soldier's head exploded, spraying brain matter and gore across the room as his body collapsed in a heap. The bang of the gunshot echoed across the buildings and sand dunes that made up this town, startling the group into action as they tried to work out what had just happened. The sound of another booming gunshot bounced from wall to wall as another Haggarthian dropped with a new hole in his chest, spurring the entire group to desperately find cover. More shots rang out with deadly accuracy, the sound of Terran-made gunfire bringing death and destruction. The primates were one of the few species who had kept their physical bullets when transitioning to space. The risk of such weapons puncturing a pressurized spacefaring vessel was offset by their love for things that went bang. And go bang they did. The Hagorthians were a hardy species, their tough armor difficult to penetrate for most firearms. Of course, the Terran response to such a problem was bring more gun. The Terran who was shooting at them from their vantage point had brought a whole lot of gun. Raxel poked her head out slowly from cover, scanning the surroundings for any sign of where the attack was coming from. She spotted a flash of light from a building across the sand-covered streets as another shot was fired, the bullet ricocheting off the cover she was hiding behind. It would have been imperceptible to most species, but the Hagorthians had exceptional eyesight. In the brief moment before being forced back into cover, Raxel swore she could see feathers fluttering in the wind and sound of honking, taunting her and her squad as she was pinned down. Of course, if you'd have asked any Terran about what that sound meant, they'd regale you with tales of aggressive birds from hell, territorial and evil. Nobody wanted to mess with a Canadian goose. "They firing from over there. Building to north. Use the breacher to take the entire thing down." She pointed at the location she'd spotted the shots from, and then the heavy mechanized vehicle that the Hagorthians used to assault any highly defended locations. The cannon on the top of the tank easily strong enough to cause the Terran's vantage point to collapse. 3 of the Hagorthians made a break for it, one immediately collapsing as another shot rang out, 2 of the reptilians successfully breaking cover and making it to their vehicle of war, desperately wrenching the door open to get to safety. Unfortunately for them, there was none to be found. The Terrans had perfectly predicted the Hagorthians' moves, meaning they were ready far in advance for the reptiles to try and use the machine. Insects poured out of the machine, yellow, angry, and looking for blood. A scream sounded out, a rare thing, not a battle cry or a roar of defiance, but a high-pitched scream of absolute terror as the duo were consumed by the stinging insects, all rational thought gone as pain consumed them. Not that any Terran would blame them. Hornets were well known to be the most evil of insects. They thrashed and swatted at the swarm as hundreds of them stung at their vital parts, blinding them and injecting the unfortunate Hagorthians with a lethal amount of hornet venom. A few swipes connected, ending with insects tumbling to the ground. Not that this mattered, because their name was Legion and Legion was many. Raxel stood, pinned down in her position, unable to move as chaos overtook her squad, half of the number already dead or heavily wounded, gunshots still raining down upon their position, while the insect swarm continued attacking members. Everything had just generally gone to hell. In the middle of all of this, she noticed a figure creeping towards the machine they were guarding, black and white, sharp claws meant for digging, wearing the distinctive gear and uniform of the Terran Alliance. It was doing something to the machine. It seemed to notice Raxel staring at it, and even though the thing was less than a foot tall, it glared back at her before going back to what it was doing. Of course, it didn't care about the 13-foot-tall reptile. Honey badgers don't give a shit. Luckily for Raxel, someone closer to the machine also saw what was going on, raising their weapon to stop the Terran from doing whatever they were doing to the thing they were guarding. Then, in a blur of brown, the Hagorthian disappeared, leaving only a hole in the wall that the unfortunate reptile had been tackled through. It was a sight that would strike fear in the hearts of anyone from Canada. The bellowing sheer power of a moose made them one of the deadliest creatures on the planet Earth. Raxel couldn't concentrate on the new problem, however, as the strange creature messing with the machine had finished their work, making a break for it in a full-out sprint and launching themselves at the closest unfortunate Hagorthian. The little black and white uplift clawing their way up the giant reptile as the Hagorthian desperately tried to swipe and grab at the thing. Unsuccessfully, as eventually the Terran climbed their way up the soldier, dodging attacks left and right before attaching themselves to Reptile's face, the Hagorthian now openly roaring in frustration and pain at the claws digging into their flesh. Not that they would have this problem for much longer, the uplift pulling a dagger from their belt and repeatedly slamming it into the soldier's eye socket. Die! 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 Each screamed word full of manic, angry energy, each word punctuated with a stab as the crazy Terran was quickly covered from head to toe in blood as the Hagorthian collapsed to the floor with a thud. "Who else wants some? I brought enough to share." Whether or not the honey badger had enough to share would never be known, however, as the goal of the Terran special covert operation attacking their position, unofficially known as the Bastard Squad, had successfully distracted the Hagorthian defenders long enough to allow the honey badger the chance to dig towards the machine that had been holding off the Terran's automated systems, and plant the explosive, an explosive that went off a little too close to Raxel. A mixture of pain and confusion ran through the Hagorthian squad leader as she tossed several feet by the explosion that tore what she was guarding into tiny metallic shreds. Confusion and disarray entered her mind, quite literally as her brain slammed at unsafe speeds into the side of her skull, reducing her consciousness to a blurry mess of noises and sensations. Raxel wasn't sure how long she was out for. Seconds, minutes, hours. When she came back to her senses, the fighting had long since ceased. The rest of the guards were dead. The signs of what the Terrans had done were everywhere, crushed against walls, lying on the floor, or just generally splattered amongst the sands. The Hagorthian tried to get up with an agonizing pain, only to feel a large, heavy foot stomp down on her chest, belonging to the deadliest land mammal on planet Earth, the uplifted hippo glaring down at her, weapon pointed at her head as Raxel froze. She could see all 5 of them now, gathered around her, strange creatures from Earth, uplifts Raxel had never seen before. Humans loved their children, whether they're digital creations in AI or the pets and competitions they have uplifted. Even they could admit that granting these 5 animals in particular sapience was a little bit unorthodox. These 5 knew they had a reputation, of their unlikely origin and what they were known for amongst humans. They were more than happy to fulfill this reputation when it was needed, especially when some upstart shitty slaving empire decided to threaten those they called friends and family. The hippo leaned down, pushing the gun against Raxel's head as she stayed very, very still, giving her a close-up view of her tusks and powerful jaw. A jaw that could crush her head open like a ripe watermelon, a jaw that spoke words that threatened violence and pain against those who would go against their creators. "I heard you talking shit about Earth." If you love engaging stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all the latest episodes from FY Stories.